I was the built-in babysitter, the unpaid assistant, the family safety net, until the day my son barked at me for being 10 minutes late while I lay in the dark with a migraine. My loyalty had been worn thin, and that word, late, felt like the last stitch coming undone. My name is Gwendolyn, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the mornings that began before dawn, when the house smelled of coffee and my knees complained at every step. Tyrell was a lanky boy who learned to whistle on my porch. Now he was a father of 3. I baked cornbread for Sunday dinners and left a casserole on the neighbor's step when someone had a rough week. Those acts were not transactional at first. There was a currency to love in our family. Stewed greens traded for a listening ear, prayer for a hard week. The early years were tender. Giving felt like breathing. Then the requests multiplied. Ma, can you pick Malik up? His coach is running behind. Gwen, we hit traffic. Can you feed Isaiah? A text for milk, a call for diapers, a plea for help when a meeting ran long. I paid for things with a card I told myself I would get back. I stayed nights on a sleeper couch when a child was sick and the parents had deadlines. I kept my mouth shut about the money because the worry of a child going without felt sharper than the pinch in my own account. We are taught not to make others suffer for your boundaries, and so I became the default ease in their lives. A migraine would sometimes bend my world into white noise. One Thursday morning, the lights scraped my eyelids, and every sound felt like a buzzsaw. I texted Tyrell before noon. Battling something bad today, might be late. He didn't answer. At 3:20, a car horn blared outside, the kind that says, "Hurry up," like someone's time matters more than a human body. He stomped up the walk and with neighbors' eyes on us said flatly, "You've been late, Mom. We can't keep doing this." He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't notice the curtains drawn or the bottle of medicine on the table. He spoke like he was addressing an employee, not his mother. That night, I tucked Zoe in, smoothing her hair with careful fingers and feeling a fierce tenderness that was now threaded with a new thought. My kindness has been read as obligation. I kissed the other 2, lingering longer than usual, aware of pain in my temples, as if the headache were another voice telling me to be careful. I turned on my laptop and searched for something that had no responsibilities attached. 3 months of sea, ports that didn't ask me to be small. A Mediterranean cruise flashed on the screen, and when I clicked reserve, my hands did not tremble. I did not tell anyone. Booking felt like a prayer that began with me. The week before I left was a study in small withdrawals. I opened bank apps I had avoided, noticing a pattern of small, constant transfers labeled things like kids' expenses or family. I called the utility office and moved a few auto payments, not to be cruel, but to make sure my own bills wouldn't suffer while I was gone. Each small action unhooked a thread that had been stitched into their canvas of daily life. I packed lightly, linen dresses, a prayer shawl, family photos tucked into a compact envelope, and I left a note on the kitchen counter, simple, factual. No door slamming, no accusations. I will not be available to pick up the children or cover household expenses while I'm away. Please make other arrangements. The sentence was both a boundary and a boundary I'm only now teaching myself to hold. Before boarding, I called the school and asked them to update the list of authorized pickups. I mailed a signed form so the secretary would see ink and know I meant it. A banker asked if I was traveling, and I lied, small, true, for health reasons. The fabric of my participation shifted by tiny increments until my absence was not a rumor, but a planned event. I did not want to punish them. I wanted to stop being their scaffolding. When I turned the key in the front door and walked away from my porch, the lift in my chest was uneven, equal parts grief and relief. The very next morning, the house was quieter than it had been in years, a silence that felt both foreign and earned. My neighbor waved from across the street, offering a casserole that felt like a benediction for my leaving. I stepped into a taxi and felt the city recede with the same relentlessness of the tide. I was not running. I was choosing a place where my presence was mine alone, even if only for a while. On the ship, under a sky that promised nothing from anyone, the first message came from a neighbor. "Tyrell's at your house. Kids alone. Police called." It was a small text that carried a loud weight. I set my cup down and let the ocean noise cushion the sudden spike in my chest. They had been so steady in depending on me, I knew, faintly, how the gears would grind when I stepped away. Back home, the entitlement that had been politely hidden in family jokes unrolled into sharper shape. Tyrell and Monique had been good at convincing themselves they deserved my sacrifices because they'd been born to them. Requests I had once answered joyfully hardened into assumptions. Monique, who worked long hours in marketing and liked to present an image of calm competence, would offload chores with a laugh that demanded, "Come on, Gwen, you stay and help tonight, won't you?" Her tone carried the arrogance of a person who has never had to wring out a child's shirt at midnight. Small financial asks were treated like plumbing, fixes some other hand would reach for. "Can you just cover the sitter?" Tyrell texted. "We have a meeting we can't miss." The tone was transactional, a voice that expected the door to open because it always had. Once, in the middle of a family lunch, Monique leaned back, scrolling while I cleared plates, and said without looking up, "You don't have to do everything, Aunt Gwen." It landed like someone telling me I shouldn't be needed. There was no gratitude, only an assumption that my labor was inexhaustible. They began to judge me in public spaces. At a neighborhood barbecue, Tyrell mentioned casually that I'd been late to pick up the kids earlier in the week. The way he said it, like a badge he'd been wronged by, felt deliberate, as if he was announcing a verdict. I sat there, folding a napkin, feeling layers of exhaustion lift by tiny degrees, as if a pressure valve had finally opened. His words were not cruel in the cartoonish sense. They were cold and entitled, the kind of betrayal that doesn't need screams to be effective. When I left, I had cut off the easy lines they used, auto pays, shared cards, permission slips, but I hadn't expected the speed of the unraveling. A week after I sailed, automatic transfers from my account to family expenses were declined because I'd canceled cards and put holds on some payments to protect my own bills. The bank's automated fraud system, sensing a pattern of sudden changes, flagged an account and froze certain transfers. For them, it turned on like a light being switched off. The day the daycare called with an unfriendly voicemail, "We cannot accept the children without payment." Tyrell's world compressed into an urgent, sharp point. He called me frantic, his voice a mixture of anger and pleading. "Ma, what did you do? You can't just—" he started, and I realized he expected me to plug the hole I had deliberately closed. He couldn't conceive that I might refuse indefinitely. He had been raised to believe that my forgiveness and labor were inexhaustible. They were convinced of their right to my labor in the way people convince themselves of the weather's permanence. Monique's demotion, when it came months later, was tied to missed deadlines they blamed on unexpected family commitments. Yet those so-called family commitments were the direct result of a family structure that had depended on secret scaffolding. The betrayal was double. They had used me until my edges frayed, and then they complained when I would not mend myself for their convenience. Before I could fully permit the satisfaction of the distance, a twist arrived that neither of us had planned. Tyrell, in a panic, tried to access a virtual wallet he'd used for months, an account he'd charged to what he'd assumed was his card. The bank, seeing a pattern of canceled auto payments and then an unfamiliar attempt to add cards, froze the account pending verification. It was an institutional hand doing exactly what institutions do when patterns change. For them, the freeze read like punishment. For me, it was a consequence that finally forced them to reckon with adult responsibilities they had outsourced. I watched the aftermath from sunlit decks and stone piers, feeling no glee, only a clear distance. They were not villains. They were people who had become comfortable with being carried. Their arrogance was not always loud. It was a quiet confidence that someone else would catch them when they fell. I had stopped being that someone. The very next week, their tidy suburban schedule began to fray. Missed, deadlines postponed, a lawn left uncut. The small things that had been mine to fix were suddenly their problem. The first time I saw a photo on my phone of a playground with children unattended, my chest tightened, not with triumph, but recognition. This was the work of growth. When the bread of family is eaten with fingers that don't say thank you, the crumbs accumulate into an ache. I remember sitting one night on the promenade of a port town with a pastry and a cup of coffee that tasted like strength. I opened my emails and found a string from Tyrell: apology, excuse, plea, panic. He had called the neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, who had left me a message describing how the kids had been left when they had meetings. My absence had become a mirror they didn't like. Before leaving, I had canceled the grocery subscription my card quietly covered. I had removed myself as an authorized pickup at school. I had frozen a small line of credit I'd been treating as family. Each of those acts felt like a small suicide of my old self. But without my weekly checks and small rescue transfers, their household finances showed vulnerabilities they'd hidden. Bounced charges, late notices, and unpaid invoices are not dramatic, but they are exact. They build a portrait of a life that had grown used to being supported by invisible hands. I did not want to see them ashamed. I wanted them sober. So I clicked off my phone and allowed silence to do what gentle words hadn't. A hard twist arrived when Tyrell's employer sent an email labeled concern. He had missed a major client call because he was juggling morning logistics with no backup plan. Monique, who had relied on me to keep the domestic ship floating, missed a presentation and later found herself reassigned to less visible work. Their professional lives, cushioned by my maternal labor, showed the seams when the cushion was removed. A neighbor forwarded me a picture of a stack of unpaid notices shoved under their door: utility, internet, a landscaper's invoice. The sight of it did something to me that surprised me, a sharp, clear pity that was not indulgent. For the first time, I could see where my help had been a bandage, not a cure. The twist was simple and unromantic. Without continued rescue, systems do what they must, and people learn to be responsible or suffer the consequences. I watched that learning curve begin from the slow luxury of foreign sunsets. They scrambled. Tyrell called in favors that people now said, no more. The babysitter I had recommended years ago texted him back, I can't cover shifts for free. I work 2 jobs. That message, short and practical, landed harder than any lecture I could have given. Monique started paying a neighbor for laundry folding. Tyrell set up a carpool with a coworker. What felt punitive was actually a graduation, messy, painful, necessary. Another twist arrived without ceremony. A frozen bank account triggered by canceled auto-pays meant a landscaper stopped coming, the babysitter stopped answering, and a client relationship frayed. The ripple was steady and unromantic, and exactly the kind of consequence that teaches accountability. I didn't orchestrate malice. I withdrew and watched the natural order make space for them to find footing. This withdrawal was my soft revenge. Soft because there was no spectacle, no shriek of payback, only a precise, quiet removal of my unpaid labor. I packed only what I needed, folded a prayer shawl into my bag, and walked away without a scene. The choice to stop was not performed in anger. It was done with the dignity of someone finally claiming her own oxygen. The next morning I woke to messages that read like confessions. We are trying, Monique typed. It's harder than I thought, Tyrell admitted. They were learning in real time, fumbling with bank apps and daycare enrollment forms. Somewhere in the scramble, they hit humility. That slow arrival at accountability is seldom pretty, but it is often the only way to grow. Consequences do not always look like punishments. Often they arrive as work, phone calls, forms, missed checks, and people are not prepared to do the labor they'd outsourced. The Monday after my bank flagged the cancellations, the daycare left a voicemail informing them of denied entry. 3 times that week, Tyrell missed calls with clients because he was negotiating late pickups. His supervisor, polite but firm, asked for evidence of reliability. Monique's manager placed her on a less visible team after a missed deadline. The neat life they curated began to tilt. An unexpected twist deepened the lesson. One morning, Tyrell tried to sign a form for a weekend rental he'd planned as a family treat. The card he assumed was his was declined. The bank's fraud algorithms had frozen transfers until verification. He did not have the paperwork to verify because he'd been living on my goodwill. The rental company kept the deposit. The babysitter, unpaid, stopped answering calls. Little things, the landscaper's notice, the unpaid electrician invoice, built into a chorus of consequence that could be heard from the curb. Neighbors noticed the shift. Mrs. Henderson left a polite note about children playing late without supervision. The neighborhood chat, which had once admired Tyrell's grill skills and Monique's spotless garden, turned cautious, offering discreet help but also new boundaries. If anyone needs a favor, we can trade, someone posted, the implied lesson being, favors aren't endless. Their social capital had been spent. I did not celebrate their discomfort. I ate grilled fish in a small harbor town and felt only a clear, settled calm. When Tyrell's voicemail came frantic and short, "Mom, please, we need you," I didn't hurry back. I let consequence be their instructor for a while longer. That is how soft revenge works. Not by humiliation, but by allowing natural consequence room to teach. The collapse that came was not cataclysmic. The house did not fall into ruin. It simply required hands that had long been idle to learn to move. Monique learned to set reminders and fold laundry at night. Tyrell started a spreadsheet to manage their monthly bills and took on an evening shift to compensate for lost income. They made mistakes, forgetting to set up autopay, missing a court notice for a traffic ticket, and each mistake prompted a new routine. Watching them wobble and find balance was not vindictive. It was a necessary rearrangement. A twist that surprised even me came when an old friend, Mrs. Lewis from church, reached out and offered to come by once a week to help with meal planning for a small fee. It was not charity, it was a neighborly work-sharing arrangement that preserved dignity. The community that had once relied entirely on me began to discover other levers of support. They learned, slowly, that a village is made of reciprocation, not exploitation. I continued my days abroad, walking cobbled streets and listening to women in markets barter, watching the tide take things away and leave other things in calmer, honest piles. I thought of the way life teaches through small, unavoidable consequences, and felt a peace that was not mean, but measured. When I returned home, I did not expect bouquets or apologies delivered like court-ordered penance. I expected work. The house smelled faintly of detergent, and a casserole sat on the counter with a note, trying, M&T. Tyrell came by later, carrying a list and wearing a look I recognized as humility. Monique arrived with clean hands. They had done laundry, set up a daycare payment plan, and bought storage tubs for the children's toys. They were learning the muscle I had toned for them over decades. They asked, with a careful voice, if I would watch the children for a single morning while Monique attended an important work training. I looked at the potted basil on my windowsill, new growth, green and alive, and felt the steady weight of the seasons. I could have said yes immediately out of reflex. Instead, I asked for paperwork, receipts for sitter payments, a schedule showing carpool arrangements, proof of the new emergency fund they'd promised to start. They handed over a binder of documents, hands shaking. It was not theatrical. It was adult. "Bless your heart," I said softly. I told them I would help for one morning that month if they kept to the plan and followed through on payments. They accepted the terms with a gratitude that had been absent before. The posture of their thanks was different now, not a demand but an offering. Their remorse was not performative, it was practical. Healing settled in ordinary textures, the slow stirring of a morning coffee, my basil on the sill that I watered at dawn, the quiet joy of folding a shirt without thinking of who would benefit. I walked along the river one afternoon and listened to women in a market trade recipes. I learned to enjoy food that no one had requested I cook. I slept without the buzz of an invisible pager in my pocket. Months later, Tyrell knocked and left a small plate of hush puppies on my step, a private apology. Monique waved at me across the sidewalk, a small, genuine smile. They were not absolved by a single gesture. They were changed by daily acts of grown-up responsibility. Their learning was not perfection, but it held a new honesty. The ending is not a triumphal shout. It is a quiet portrait. Me in a linen dress on my porch at dusk, a cup cooling in both hands, the basil leaf between my fingers crushed to release its scent. I breathe in that ordinary perfume and close my eyes. Behind me, a house hums with its own life and learning. Before me, a small pot of green promises that I can be soft and firm both at once. I do not return to being everyone's scaffolding. I return to being myself, gentle, resolved, and finally free to guard the peace I have earned.